Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Welcome to this deep dive. If you are listening to this right now, you're likely a nursing student gearing up for your maternity exams. And I just want to say right up front, you've got this.
You absolutely do. I'm really thrilled to be doing this with you today.
Yeah, and today we're basically settling in for a focused one-on-one tutoring session. Our mission is to help you completely master Chapter 10, which is fetal development and genetics.
Right, from essentials of maternity, newborn, and women's health nursing. It's a dense chapter, but I want to validate the intense effort you're putting into your studies. This material is incredibly important.
It really is. It bridges that gap between, microscopic cellular changes and the actual real-world nursing assessments you'll be doing at the bedside.
Exactly. And to keep your studying perfectly aligned, we're going to follow the exact logical progression of the textbook. We'll build from normal anatomy into the complications and show you how those translate into assessment findings.
So the chapter opens with a thought that is it's wild to think about. When a single sperm and an egg unite, they bring together about 25,000 genes in this highly complex, almost miraculous process.
It really is miraculous. And understanding it isn't just about passing a multiple choice test. It's about being the nurse who can identify when something goes wrong in that process and knowing how to step in.
So let's start by unpacking the timeline. Pregnancy is traditionally tracked as 280 days, right? Or 40 weeks from the first day of the last menstrual period, the LMP.
Right, but fertilization actually happens about 14 days after that period begins.
Which brings us to our first major milestone, the preembryonic stage.
That's the perfect starting point. The preembryonic stage runs from fertilization through the second week. So to understand fertilization, or conception, which occurs in the outer third of the fallopian tube, we have to look at the cellular math.
The haploid and diploid numbers.
Exactly. Before they even meet, the egg and the sperm undergo gametogenesis and a special type of cell division called meiosis. This ensures that the gametes, the egg, and sperm each carry a haploid number of chromosomes.
Meaning they each have 23 single chromosomes.
Right. So when they finally fuse together, they create a diploid zygote with the standard human number of 46 chromosomes.
I've always found the mechanics of that fusion so fascinating. I mean, every milliliter of semen contains over 200 million sperm, but only one actually gets to fertilize the egg. How does the egg manage to lock all the others out once the winner gets in?
It's essentially a microscopic force field. The egg has this clear outer protein layer called the zona pellucida.
Zona pellucida, got it.
Once a single sperm penetrates that layer, a chemical reaction happens that physically blocks out all the remaining sperm. It's a brilliant biological defense mechanism.
And it's at that exact moment of penetration that the biological sex is determined, right?
Yes. And as a nurse, you need to know this genetic rule. The mother's egg always carries an X chromosome. Always. It's the father's sperm, which carries either an X or a Y that determines the sex.
So if an X-bearing sperm wins the race, the result is an XX female. And if a Y-bearing sperm wins, you get an XY male.
You've got it.
Okay, so we have this newly formed single-cell zygote sitting in the outer edge of the fallopian tube. What happens as it starts to make its way down toward the uterus?
Well, it begins a really active journey. As it travels, the zygote undergoes rapid cellular division called mitosis, or cleavage. It quickly divides into a 16-cell solid ball called a morula.
Which literally translates to little mulberry.
Yes, exactly. And as it keeps dividing and finally enters the uterus, fluid fills its center, transforming it from a solid mass into a hollow ball of cells known as a blastocyst.
Before we move on to implantation, what about twins? Where do they factor into this early cellular division?
That's a very common question you'll get from expecting parents. Identical or monozygotic twins occur when one single fertilized egg splits into two. They share exactly the same genes and usually share the same placenta.
And fraternal twins?
Fraternal or dizygotic twins happen when two entirely separate eggs are fertilized by two separate sperm. They usually have their own placentas and are no more genetically alike than any other siblings.
That makes sense. Let's follow this holoblastocyst into the uterus now. About 7 to 10 days after conception, implantation happens. The outer layer of the blastocyst, the trophoblast, attaches to the nutrient-rich upper part of the uterus, the fundus.
The fundus, yes.
I know the fundus is a major focus for nursing assessments later on. Why does the blastocyst implant there specifically?
Because the fundus is the ideal real estate for a growing pregnancy. It has a rich blood supply to nourish the embryo, and crucially, it has very thick, strong muscle fibers.
So later, after the baby is born and the placenta detaches, those strong muscles will clamp down on the blood vessels to prevent postpartum hemorrhage.
Precisely. Now, concurrent with that implantation, the inner cells of the blastocyst differentiate into 3 primary germ layers that will dictate all human anatomy.
The ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm.
Right. The ectoderm forms the central nervous system, special senses, and skin. The mesoderm forms the skeleton, the heart, and the reproductive organs. And finally, the endoderm forms the respiratory and digestive systems.
Every single tissue and organ originates from those 3 layers, which brings us to what is arguably the most critical window of development, the embryonic city.
Yes, day 15 through week 8.
Looking at table 10.1 in the text, the timeline is staggering. Before many women even realize they're pregnant, major organ systems are forming. By week 3, the brain, spinal cord, and heart begin to develop.
And by week 5, that heart is actually beating at a regular rhythm.
Which is incredible. And by the end of week 8, it actually resembles a human being, the heart development is complete, and the placenta is fully working.
Because development is so rapid here, the embryo requires an incredibly stable environment. It's protected by 2 embryonic membranes. The chorion, which forms from the trophoblast, and the amnion, which originates from the ectoderm.
Together forming the fluid-filled amniotic sac, or the bag of waters.
Right, and this amniotic fluid is dynamic. It regulates the embryo's temperature, cushions it from trauma, allows for symmetric physical growth, and permits the free movement necessary for musculoskeletal development.
As a nurse, you're constantly monitoring the volume of that fluid. What are the clinical implications when those levels are off?
Fluid assessment is a huge part of prenatal care. Too little fluid, defined as less than 500 milliliters at term, is called oligohydramnios.
Oligohydramnios. And since fetal urine makes up a lot of that fluid later on, that points to kidney issues.
Kidney issues or uteroplacental insufficiency? Yes. Imagine you're at the bedside, and the fundal height is measuring much smaller than expected for the gestational age. You'd suspect oligohydramnios.
And the flip side is hydramnios.
Right, too much fluid, over 2,000 milliliters. If the fundal height is measuring way larger than expected, your mind should jump to hydramnios and start checking the mother's chart for maternal diabetes.
Because high maternal blood sugar causes the fetus to produce excess urine.
Exactly. It can also point to fetal anomalies in the central nervous system, or GI tract, that are preventing the fetus from swallowing the fluid normally.
Connecting all of this is the umbilical cord and the placenta. The cord anatomy is a classic exam question. 1 large vein and 2 small arteries protected by Wharton's jelly, which keeps it from being compressed.
Yes. AVA, artery, vein. Artery is a good way to remember. There are 2 arteries and 1 vein.
But the placenta is what really fascinates me. It acts like its own endocrine gland. What hormones is it pumping out?
It's a massive hormone factory. First, you have HCG, which maintains the pregnancy in the very early days. That's what pregnancy tests detect.
Then HPL, human placental lactogen,
which alters maternal metabolism to ensure the fetus gets a steady supply of glucose. Estrogen stimulates the enlargement of the breasts and uterus. Progesterone is the great maintainer. It stabilizes the endometrium and decreases uterine contractions.
To prevent premature labor and relaxin.
Does exactly what it sounds like. It softens the cervix and pelvic ligaments to prepare the body for birth.
That's a lot of chemical communication. But physically, how does the mother's blood interact with the fetal blood?
Theoretically, maternal blood and fetal blood never actually mix. There's a microscopic placental barrier made of fetal tissue. The mother's blood washes over these fetal vessels, and nutrients and oxygen simply diffuse across the barrier.
But it's a pass-through, not a brick wall.
Unfortunately, yes. Nutrients diffuse easily, but so do drugs, alcohol, and viruses.
Which makes the embryo incredibly vulnerable, especially during those first 8 weeks. This is where teratogens come into play. But there are so many to memorize. How should a student approach this?
Categorize them by the mechanism of harm. A teratogen is any substance, organism, or physical agent that causes abnormal development. The embryonic stage is the absolute danger zone because cells are rapidly differentiating.
So if a teratogen interrupts week 4 or 5, it doesn't just cause a minor issue, it can halt the development of an entire organ system.
Exactly. Infections are critical. You'll hear the acronym 2 or CH used to group the most severe ones. Your text highlights toxoplasma, syphilis, rubella, cytomegalovirus, CMV varicella, and herpes.
Toxoplasma is the one associated with cat litter, right?
Yes, and it can lead to severe neurological issues like blindness and seizures. Rubella and CMV are notorious for severely impacting fetal brain development and causing profound deafness.
What about environmental exposures and medications?
You have physical agents like ionizing radiation, chemical exposures like organic mercury and lead. And managing maternal conditions is huge. Poorly controlled maternal diabetes, or PKU, creates a toxic metabolic environment.
And drugs, obviously.
Yes. Cocaine acts as a massive vasoconstrictor and can cause abruptio placenta, where the placenta tears away from the wall. Alcohol causes fetal alcohol syndrome.
Even legal prescriptions are dangerous.
Very. Tetracycline, an antibiotic, will permanently stain the developing baby's teeth. ACE inhibitors for blood pressure can cause severe intrauterine growth restriction and prematurity.
So the nurse's role is heavily rooted in proactive education and reviewing medication lists. Now, assuming the pregnancy makes it safely through that embryonic period, we enter the fetal stage, end of week 8 until birth.
The organs are already formed, so this is a time of dramatic growth and refinement. Following table 10.1 again, by week 12, gender can be determined on ultrasound, and the fetal kidneys are producing urine.
Week 16 is quickening, right? The mother feels movement.
Yes. By week 20, we see vernix caseosa, that thick white protective film, along with brown fat for temperature regulation. And at week 24, a massive milestone. The alveoli form in the lungs, and they begin producing surfactant.
Which keeps the tiny air sacs from collapsing. That's critical for premature infants.
Absolutely vital.
Which perfectly transitions us to one of the most notoriously complex topics you'll be tested on: fetal circulation. It feels like plumbing gone rogue. Blood is going in opposite directions compared to an adult. Can you break down these 3 vital shunts?
It looks chaotic, but there's brilliant logic to it. The core concept to grasp is that the fetal lungs and the fetal liver are essentially non-functional in utero. The placenta is doing the breathing and the heavy filtering.
So the highly oxygenated blood returning from the placenta needs to bypass the liver and those fluid-filled lungs.
Exactly. Priority goes straight to the brain and heart. Let's trace it. Oxygenated blood travels from the placenta through the single umbilical vein. As it travels up toward the liver, it hits the first bypass, the ductus venosus.
The ductus venosus connects the umbilical vein directly to the inferior vena cava, right?
Yes, diverting the majority of that rich blood completely away from the liver. This blood enters the main venous system and flows into the right atrium of the heart.
In an adult, that blood drops into the right ventricle and goes to the lungs.
But the fetus already has oxygen, and the lungs are full of amniotic fluid, creating massive physical resistance. So instead, the blood hits shunt number 2, the foramen oval.
The opening between the right and left atria.
Right. Blood shoots straight through that flap into the left side of the heart, bypassing the lungs entirely. From the left atrium, it moves to the left ventricle and pumps up into the ascending aorta to feed the brain and upper body.
But surely some blood still makes it down into the right ventricle.
It does, and it gets pumped toward the pulmonary artery. But it hits that huge resistance from the fluid-filled lungs. So right there in the pulmonary artery is shunt number 3, the ductus arteriosus,
which diverts that blood directly out of the pulmonary artery and into the descending aorta,
pushing it out to the rest of the body and eventually back to the placenta through the 2 umbilical arteries to get more oxygen.
It's perfectly designed to avoid the lungs and liver, but at birth, the cord is cut. What happens to all those shortcuts?
It's a dramatic physiological event. The baby takes that first massive breath, the lungs inflate, pushing the amniotic fluid out, and the pulmonary resistance drops to almost 0.
So blood rushes into the lungs.
Yes, and that massive return of blood to the left atrium raises the pressure on the left side of the heart, physically forcing the flap of the foramen ovale to slam shut.
And clamping the umbilical cord stops the blood flow from the placenta,
which causes the ductus venosus to collapse and close. Finally, the massive surge of oxygen triggers the smooth muscle in the ductus arteriosus to constrict and shut down entirely.
And as a nurse, you're assessing that newborn's color, respiratory effort, and listening to the heart to ensure those shunts actually closed properly.
Exactly.
Let's shift gears from anatomy to the blueprint itself, genetics. The materials note that genetics is the study of individual genes, while genomics is how those genes interact with the environment.
Thanks to the Human Genome Project, we know we have about 30,000 genes, and we are 99.9% identical at the DNA level.
To educate patients, nursing students need the foundational terminology. We have 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. 22 autosomes, and 1 pair of sex chromosomes.
Right. Genotype is the genetic makeup hidden at the DNA level. Phenotype is the outward observed appearance. You inherit 2 alleles for each gene. Homozygous means they are exactly the same. Heterozygous means they're different.
How do we explain Mendelian disorders to patients without overwhelming them?
Break it down into the 3 main inheritance patterns. First, autosomal dominant. You only need 1 abnormal dominant gene to have the disorder. There's a 50% chance of passing it on.
Like Huntington's disease or neurofibromatosis?
Yes. Next is autosomal recessive. You need 2 abnormal genes, 1 from each parent. Both parents must be carriers.
Meaning they don't show symptoms themselves.
Correct. If both are carriers, there is a 25% chance the child will have the disease and a 50% chance the child will be a carrier. Cystic fibrosis, PKU, Tay-Sachs, and sickle cell disease are common examples.
And the third pattern is X-linked inheritance, tied directly to the sex chromosomes.
The mutant gene sits on the X chromosome, and these are mostly recessive. Males are much more likely to be affected because they only have 1 X chromosome. If they inherit it, they have the disease.
Females have 2 X's, so they can be carriers without symptoms. Hemophilia and Duchenne muscular dystrophy are the big ones here.
And remember, there's never any male-to-male transmission of X-linked disorders because fathers pass their Y chromosome to their sons.
Now, not everything is clean Mendelian math. Multifactorial inheritance, like cleft lip or spina bifida, relies on a mix of genes and environmental factors.
Which is why interventions like taking folic acid are heavily emphasized.
Beyond individual genes, we have chromosomal abnormalities, often due to non-disjunction, where chromosomes fail to separate properly during cell division.
This leads to numerical abnormalities. Polyploidy, having entire extra sets of chromosomes, is generally incompatible with life. But trisomies, having 3 copies of a specific chromosome, can result in live births.
The most common is trisomy 21, Down syndrome. The risk increases with maternal age. What are the clinical signs a nurse looks for during a newborn assessment?
You'll look for a flat facial profile, small low-set ears, hypotonia, and a single deep crease across the palm known as a simian crease.
The other 2 numerical abnormalities to know are trisomy 18, Edwards syndrome, and trisomy 13, Pato syndrome.
Both are associated with profound intellectual disabilities, severe physical anomalies, and a very short life expectancy.
We also see structural abnormalities, dilutions, inversions, or translocations. Cry-du-chat syndrome is a deletion causing a cat-like cry and intellectual disability.
And Fragile X syndrome involves breaks on the X chromosome. It mostly affects males and causes intellectual disability and autistic-like behaviors.
Finally, sex chromosome abnormalities. Turner syndrome affects females missing an X chromosome. They present with short stature, webbed neck, and infertility.
And Klinefelter syndrome affects males with an extra XXXY, causing small tests, infertility, and learning disabilities.
Which brings up a vital question. How does a nursing student apply all of this? We aren't geneticists, but we're the primary contact for these families. This is where genetic counseling comes in.
Box 10.2 is clear on who needs a referral. Women over 35, couples with a family history of genetic diseases, recurrent pregnancy loss, or abnormal screening results.
And the nurse's role?
Gathering meticulous 3-generation family history, the pedigree, assessing chronic illnesses, miscarriages, and ethnic background. You also need to know the common prenatal tests.
Like the alpha-fetoprotein, or AFP blood test. High levels mean neural tube defects. Low levels suggest Down syndrome.
You also have invasive diagnostic tests like amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling, CVS used for karyotyping.
And the fetal neutral translucency test, an ultrasound measuring fluid at the back of the fetal neck. Greater than 3 millimeters is abnormal.
There's also cell-free fetal DNA testing, a non-invasive maternal blood test. But above all, nurses must ensure informed consent, safeguard privacy, and offer non-directive, non-judgmental support.
That is the cornerstone of patient advocacy. The goal is to empower the patient, never to direct them.
We've covered incredible ground today, from the fertilization of a single cell to the complex genetic codes. As technologies like pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, and gene therapy advance, the line between preventing disease and altering human potential blurs.
It really does.
So I leave you with this provocative thought. As a future nurse, how will you advocate for your patient's autonomy when science can map out their child's genetic destiny before they're even born?
That is exactly the kind of critical thinking that transforms a good nursing student into a phenomenal nurse. You have journeyed through this material, mastering the cellular changes, the fetal shunts, the genetics, and the nursing priorities. On behalf of the Last Minute Lecture team, I want to thank you for studying with us today. Keep up the hard work, and we wish you the absolute best of luck on your maternity nursing exams.